work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it, work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
Thanks for joining us. Thanks for tuning in for folks listening to the Money, Power, Land Solidarity podcast. I am really excited for this interview and really have been trying to figure out ways to talk about the Minneapolis Park Board on this podcast. We haven't talked about the Park Board too much. It's come up kind of tangentially, talking about the Upper Harbor or some of the happenings this summer. But we are lucky enough to be joined today by scholar, somebody I met through organizing and activism over the last few years, Rebecca Walker. And Rebecca is here to talk with us about her recent studies, broadly titled Green Spaces, White Faces. And it's a look at the history of collaboration between the Minneapolis Park Board and segregationist real estate developers, the role that the Minneapolis Park Board has played in creating the racial hierarchies that we live through today, and specifically hearkening back to their collaboration with the restricted racial covenants and the real estate developers who were enacting those covenants that we talked about in a recent episode with Daniel Bergen, the director of Jim Crow of the North. So we're really excited to be joined by Rebecca today. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I feel like to understand what's going on today with the Upper Harbor Terminal and with green gentrification in the Park Board, it's just like really important to have this history and to know like how the Park Board has really always worked to benefit white people and white property owners. So excited to be able to tell that story here.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you start just by sharing like what put you on this pathway? Like how did you become interested in these topics, and like, you know, what moved you to producing this kind of work? Seems almost like a culmination of a lot of effort and research.
Yeah, definitely. And it's weird because I feel like a lot of that story is like intertwined with collaborations with you. Like I feel like some of our research together where you were like, we have to look at gentrification and how parks are causing gentrification was really the first time when I started to look at like sort of the political role of parks. So a lot of my research is on green gentrification, or the way that sort of investments in environmental amenities, whether it's parks or like other forms of like green infrastructure, is like a big neoliberal buzzword right now.
Yeah.
And how those get used to like justify or sort of whitewash like gentrification processes, and like become part of like the recapitalization of spaces, of like we're going to reinvest and like make the environment super nice and make it super appealing to people who want to move here. So that's where like a lot of my research focuses. And like I said, that really came out of sort of some of the questions you were asking about, like how have these park board investments and parks that they previously ignored, like how is that changing the neighborhood, and what does that mean, and like what does that mean when it happens without protections for affordable housing? So yeah, that's how I got interested in these questions. And then especially this summer, like with the sanctuary movement, and sort of there was that moment when the park board went from being like, okay, like, yes, we should like be supporting people who are living in parks, and like that's part of what we should be doing right now in this moment in the pandemic and in the wake of the racial uprisings. And then all of a sudden they were just like, nope, like violent evictions, like fuck you, you're out. And just like, to me, that resonated with this like really long history of like who the park board has always worked to serve, and was this moment where I was like, I just like have to like document that and write about it, because I was just like so many shitty interactions with property owners around parks where there were sanctuaries that just were like, just pissed me off, just made me so mad, where like really entitled people would come up to you and be like, what are you doing helping these people, you know? And just like feeling so entitled to these parks when it's like no, like these parks are public spaces, this is public land, like everyone has a right to be here, they're not yours. So yeah, that was like, those threads together were really what like drove me to start trying to document this work in this history.
That's why it was really exciting for me to read your work. like you mentioned, I'll kind of give more of the backstory as far as how we came into relationship with one another. And it's also to give credit to the people who helped put me on this pathway. When I was in my early 20s, I'm 35 now, I got connected to this group in South Minneapolis that was doing work out of Hope Community and around PV Park on the corner of Chicago and Franklin, and documenting the ways that both the resources at PV Park, the amount of staff, the amount of programs they had, and the was so much less than the Southwest white exclusive areas, you know, and documenting that the PV Park and the Phillips neighborhood had way more young people, way more families, and just way less resources. And it was a way that this cohort of young people who were around my age were getting engaged with calling out the systemic racism in the Twin Cities and getting involved in organizing. And that research led over years into the Parks and Power campaign. And I worked on the Parks and Power campaign for about a decade in some form or fashion. And we were really using the park board as an entryway into grassroots political organizing and naming the race and class hierarchies in our city and how they show up in the parks, and using parks as organizing space. And that work in the last few years, originally we were fighting for investment. You know, we had named that PV Park and these parks in inner city neighborhoods were divested from. They weren't receiving the amount of resources that parks in white neighborhoods were. But then we noticed that all of a sudden there was a switch, and there was a big targeted investment campaign into inner city parks, into parks like PV, into parks in North Minneapolis. And while that was good and something we fought for, what we started to recognize was that the park board was kind of stealing our language and saying, look, now we're doing racial justice, right? But not naming the fact that a lot of these areas that were receiving investment were also directly targeted for real estate speculation, and we're being intensely gentrified. You know, like I was seeing this in some of the neighborhoods I grew up in Northeast, where all of a sudden we got a new park, but all of a sudden the neighborhood changed, and the working class people and the poor people who used to live there got pushed out. And there was a relationship between these two. And the first research project that we did together documented that once PV Park was slated for investment, that came at a time when the Phillips neighborhood and the adjoining neighborhoods to PV Park were experiencing the sharpest increases in rent prices across the city. So trying to tease out these relationships. So that's like kind of the long intro. And I also had a lot of those same experiences this summer, where you really saw people who live near the parks just go mask off and state clearly their assumption that they own the parks are there for them. And I think the thing that you name really explicitly that's important is the relationship between parks and the real estate market. And that's always been there. And that isn't talked about much. It's talked about as if parks are just this benevolent thing, not understanding that they're really placed there for the real estate value of the property owners adjoining. So that's a long intro on my part, but just to give people a window into this conversation that's kind of been a long time coming.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like baked into how the park board has always worked. Like almost every piece of land that the park board has, they like got by selling people on the fact that having a new park would raise their property values.
Absolutely. So I want to, before we get into the specific history and functions of the Minneapolis Park Board, I was interested reading your research about the development of kind of the urban parks movement in general. And I never knew what a urban planner or a landscape architect was until I started doing Parks and Power stuff and meeting folks who worked at the park board. So can you kind of give us that history? Like, how did these fields of urban parks and urban planning come to be? And I'm specifically interested in the story of Central Park. That seems like kind of an illustrative example that you talk about in your studies.
Yeah. And Central Park really is like ground zero, the like beginning of the urban park movement, or the city park movement in America. And this history was really interesting to me, and I didn't know it when I started this work. As someone who like does urban environmental planning, this was just totally new to me. But basically, at the origins of like urban planning and landscape architecture, like now we think of them as separate fields, where like landscape architects plan parks, and city planners like are like CPED. They like make those plans for the city, and it's more about like urban development and economic growth or whatever. But at the beginning, they were the same field, and there were these people who would like go through and make plans for the city, and they were like planning out green space, but they were also planning out where people should live. So this all like sort of came to happen at sort of the turn of the century and in the US. And it was part of the progressive movement. And I think that that's something that's really interesting, is like progressivism at this time was all about like, how do we make things more efficient? How do we like make the best, like most ideal city?
Modernize things.
Sorry, what'd you say?
How do we modernize things?
Yeah, exactly. Like how do we become more modern? How do we become more efficient? It was all like embedded in this language of science. But like a lot of the science of this day was really fucked up. Like this was the period of eugenics, and this was the period of like really intense race science, where they were trying to find like biological definitions of race. And so those values also got coded and how these like new city planners were designing space.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought one thing was really interesting. You talked about that a lot of these efforts at planning were attempts to reinstill the racial hierarchies, because you had Reconstruction happening in the South, the Civil War, emancipation, and in some places, attempts at building a new order, a more egalitarian order. There was race mixing happening. And a lot of these urban planners were saying, oh, no, we need to make sure that like the white people stay with the white people and they live in the healthy, clean areas, and we need to keep the black people separate from them and the immigrants separate from them. I thought you did a really good job in your paper kind of describing how that, like you said, that race science, racist logic was like accepted by these ruling class people who were trying to plan out these cities.
Yeah. And a lot of it was also like really explicitly to like protect capitalist interests too. Like part of it was like, we need to keep like working class white people and black people separate so they don't organize together. And that was also part of like how racial segregation and like spatial segregation in American cities came to be, like both in northern and southern cities.
That's a huge point. I think about that so much because I'm from Northeast Minneapolis, you know, and that's exactly what it was. It was the idea that like you want the immigrants to be striving to be white and to be relating to white America and not to be making common cause with black workers.
Yeah, exactly. And so this was this moment of like really intense like white supremacy, and as you were just saying, like the reestablishment of like a white order on space, and this coincided with the origins of the city park movement, and so these planners were coming through and they were trying to decide like, okay, where should we put parks, and where should we like, how should we organize the city, and so as they were designing these new like exclusive white neighborhoods, they were putting parks in them, and that was like the beginning of suburbanization, and sort of also the beginning of how like green space in American cities became coded as white space. And this was like really explicitly like a way to try and establish order. So we talked about, or you mentioned Central Park, and that story really is a story where that part of New York City wasn't empty. That wasn't like empty land. There was like a really thriving community called Seneca Village, where Black people were living that had moved there like post Civil War, part of the Great Migration, where immigrants had moved, and you had these mixing between like Irish immigrants, German immigrants, and like Black people who had migrated to the city, and they were like working together and developing their own economy and supporting one another, and it was just like totally erased. And sort of like really intentionally erased, that like the city didn't want that as part of the history. And instead they were like, nope, no one has ever been here. And they destroyed all the buildings, destroyed schools, destroyed libraries, and built this new park and like pretended like it was pristine wilderness. And so key to that was Frederick Olmstead. And he sort of like talked about as the father of landscape architecture. And his story is like honestly super weird. But he like started off as just like this like random privileged dude from Connecticut, and then he was actually a journalist who traveled around the South, like pre-Civil War, and sort of documented the condition of slavery in the South, and he was like trying to understand the South. But while he was doing that, he like got all these ideas of like what an ideal landscape should look like, and and his ideal landscapes were really these like landscapes of the plantation South, where you had like sort of managed fields and like managed grasslands, and then like the occasional large oak tree. And when you think about the landscapes that are parks today, like that's the landscape you see. So I just feel like this really like visceral feeling of like, oh, this is like literally a landscape of white supremacy, because he was recreating like an image of the plantation South when he was building parks.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't know how much, like, one thing I learned more reading your paper was how much manipulation of the landscape there was, even in building. We'll get to the specifics of Minneapolis in a bit, but that the landscape that I grew up in physically, ecologically isn't natural. You know, it was created in the image of like a New England town or a European town, and happened while, of course, you know, they were stealing the land from the Dakota people and committing a genocide. Also, literally like dredging the lakes, changing the habitat in order to appeal to the interests of these wealthy American settlers.
Yeah, I think about that all the time, that like when you look at the parks in Minneapolis, like where's the prairie? Like there's literally no prairie in our parks. It looks like a town in New England. And that like that was part of the settler colonial process, was like recreating this landscape so it doesn't look like the landscape that was like maintained and produced through indigenous land management practices, and it does look like a very white European landscape. And so I like, you know, that's not the focus of my paper, but I think that that's so important when you think about like what politically the park board was and has always been doing.
Yeah.
That like that's a big part of it.
It's deep. I wanted to make one other observation quick about Central Park, and then ask, kind of move us towards Minneapolis. I thought it was interesting you talked about like, one, like you said, they intentionally destroyed this multiracial community, this Black community that was like building an alternative economy, crushed it, created this park over the top of it. And then that must have been like one of the first examples of like park police, because they talk about that Olmstead put cops in there specifically to monitor the behavior of working class people, and it would encourage upper class, professional class people to hang out in the park to teach the uncivilized working men how to act. And I was just like, dang, that's like really an important part of all of this, you know? And I guess from other history that I know that we don't talk about in America is that at this period, you know, the late 1800s, the early 1900s, the United States had one of the most militant, organized labor movements in the world. You know, there was literal wars against, you know, between unions and organized labor fighting against the poverty conditions and these big industrialists, you know, and that this progressive movement was a part of the ruling class effort to stomp out the labor movement and protect capitalism. And like the ways that parks played into that are like deep.
Yeah, exactly. I just think that's, and I also think that just like reminds me the role that the park police in Minneapolis play today. Like it's part of that. It's a continuation of that legacy of like really trying to control in an explicit way, like the behavior of people of color, the behavior of working class people in these spaces.
One of the things that got really like always was an energizer for the Parks and Power campaign, an issue we heard so many people experience, and I've seen growing up in Minneapolis, is like, you know, park police literally just parking near and harassing places where people would play basketball. You know, if it's a basketball court and it's mostly Black men or Native men playing ball, the police are going to be there to try to shut the game down just because it's like seen as inappropriate, you know, literally to the point where there was a concerted effort to take down basketball courts in Minneapolis parks. Like we were a part of some of the groups fighting to get those basketball courts reinstalled. Or if you notice that the park board stopped putting in full court basketball courts because they didn't want Black people running up and down, basically, you know? And it's like this idea that it's supposed to be a buttoned up space for a certain type of behavior as opposed to just people living their lives. Like that racist legacy with the park police runs real deep. Can you talk about Minneapolis now? Like how did the Minneapolis Park Board come to be? It was one of Olmstead's mentees, was like the first planner, right, for the park board. But could you just kind of talk about that history? How did Minneapolis come to have a park board? And what is unique about the Minneapolis Park Board compared to other park systems?
Yeah. So Minneapolis compared to other park systems is like a separate political entity. It's a semi-autonomous or like fully autonomous, sort of depending on how you define that, governing board that functions totally separately from the city council, with like all sorts of weird political implications in Minneapolis today. And sort of, well, part of that is because the city council was like, no, we don't want to spend money on parks, like when the city first started. And so these other people were like, well, we want to have parks. So they created their own governing board. And those men who decided like, yes, we need to invest in parks. Again, this was like done in sort of like the era of progressivism and trying to like make Minneapolis a really progressive city. And
I just want to be clear for people, that doesn't mean progressive as far as like pro-gay rights or socially liberal. It means progressive as far as modern, leading, industrial, efficient, just to like, because I think that word progressive comes with so much baggage now. And really like progressive at that time was juxtaposed to populist, which was more of like an egalitarian worker, redistributive political agenda. The progressive agenda was very much like a capitalist program.
Yeah, thank you. It's like, yeah, thank you for like clarifying that. I feel like that was really confusing for me when I first started reading this, because I would see writing that would describe like racial covenants as progressive, and I was just like, what the fuck? Like,
it's deep though, because in some sense I feel like we still trick ourselves with those words, because like that's how progressives are today anyway too. You know what I'm saying? We think it means that they're like for us, but most of the times today it still means like social liberalism with like really aggressive capitalist underpinnings. Yeah,
I think that's so true. And you see that, like, this is like maybe getting ahead of ourselves, but you see that in the language of green gentrification, where it's like, oh, like environmentally friendly policies are progressive, but like look at like the way that they're harming people and the way that they're harming communities. So anyways, the park board was established by like wealthy white men who basically wanted to improve their property values. Like that's the origin story. And the park board will talk all day about how the origin story is like, oh, they wanted to create green space for all, and like parks is a democratic space. But if you look at the early history of like the parks that came to be, basically what these men would do is they would go to their wealthy friends, or they would like look at areas where they owned property, and they would say, hey, if you donate a chunk of your land, like the rest of your land will become more valuable. And that's how like the land around the lakes became parks. And that's how like the land that's Loring Park became a park. Like this was really integral to the beginning of the park system. And that's like really always how it's worked, is like, let's use parks to like improve real estate values.
Absolutely. And you do a really good job of laying that out and saying not only was that for the exclusive benefit of these landowners in the capitalist class, it was explicitly racially segregated. Can you talk about, so one thing we learned in our episode about Jim Crow of the North is that there was a huge proliferation in racially restricted covenants after 1910 through the 1930s, all the way up through the 1950s. Excuse me. But that was a time when the city was growing. You bring up some familiar names. Who was Edmund Walden? And who is Samuel Thorpe? And how did they relate to the park board? What was the park board's relationship to these segregationist real estate capitalists?
Yeah. So Edmund Walton and Samuel Thorpe were two of the biggest real estate developers in Minneapolis during this period. And they were the first two to bring racial covenants to Minneapolis and to use racial covenants on properties in Minneapolis. And like Samuel Thorpe was the president of like the National Real Estate Board. So he was not just a big name in Minneapolis. He like really sort of shaped how real estate works in America in general, which is important to remember when we're talking about this. But yeah, so these dudes were real estate developers, and the Minneapolis Park Board during this period was like super cozy with real estate developers. They would like host picnics and teas where their lawyers would come and talk to these real estate developers about like, hey, like if you help us give us some land, like we'll improve your values. So this was really explicit that like parks were a selling feature for a new property. And also at this time, like you talked about in the episode of Jim Crow in the North, like whiteness was a selling feature. Like these covenants were advertised and used as a marketing tool of like, hey, if you put this racial covenant in, this is like a guarantee that this property will stay white. Like that's something that like makes the property more expensive. And so these real estate men would work with the park board to, when they like got a new piece of land or got some new property, they would work with the park board to donate a chunk of it or like sell it for super cheap. And then the park board would build a new park, and then they would put racial covenants on the rest of the land around it, and then be able to sell that land for more money. And I can go through and like tell some of the specific stories of like particular parks where they did that.
I think that'd be cool. That'd be really cool. I think you tell a really powerful story about Brackett Park in terms of the way that Brackett Park showed up this summer. Maybe that's one to start. I'd like to hear a couple.
Yeah. So Brackett Park was one of the first ones that was like really mobilizing for me. But so this summer there was a sanctuary established at Brackett Park for women and children, and it was on this very land that was donated, that like had racial covenants, and was donated by one of these segregationist developers named Mary Dorman Greer, and she was having trouble selling. She was having trouble selling the land in that neighborhood. Like it was kind of marginal. Like no one wanted to move there. And this is, this is now today land that's like along the river, and like
highly prized. Yeah.
Like definitely pretty valuable today. But yeah, she couldn't convince anybody to move there. So she donated basically the whole eastern half of Brackett Park. She donated, and then she put racial covenants on all of the land surrounding it. And so that park, like as it opened, it was explicitly a park that was like for white use only, because all of the property around it was whites only. And like we talk about how space gets coded, you would be risking like violence if you were a person of color and you tried to go into that neighborhood.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that like created this like de facto Jim Crow system of segregation in our park system.
Yeah, and you show at that time that the majority of parks that came online in that period were within half a mile of a restricted racial covenant development. So you really trace, just to state it clearly again, is we have a autonomous political body, the Minneapolis Park Board, that was created by this cohort of real estate developers and leading men of property, and then worked throughout the city to proliferate whites-only neighborhoods and then build a whites-only park system, And it's like as simple as that. I think it's important. One fact that we didn't establish starting this interview, but that I bring up a lot, which is really important, is that the Minneapolis Park Board is the largest property holder in the city of Minneapolis. And it's one of the drawing points, or one of the areas that one of the dynamics we would point to with Parks and Power is to say, okay, some folks growing up locally, working class people, you might be organized to know who's the mayor or who's on your city council. But the park board, it's not a department of the city. It's its own elected body, like we said. And you're laying out a history, which I started to perceive just through living through the consequences today, is that this was even less democratic than we already know. Like we don't, in our capitalist society, it's not really a democracy. The park board is a great example of that. You have the largest property holder in the city making huge land deals directly tied to who can live where, committed to and collaborating with some of the most aggressive white supremacists and segregationists of their time. That's has huge implications for us today. And that's what we see in the way that they function today. Because sometimes I have to just keep saying that simple formula back to myself. Sorry to blab, but another thing, when you talked about the T's that they used to have, so the park board is out there hosting events, recruiting real estate developers to collaborate with them, and it was their lawyer who was selling them. That brought me back to Brian Rice. We did an episode on Brian Rice on the podcast, and he was a figure in our organizing, the attorney for the park board, also the chief lobbyist for the park board, also the lobbyist for the union of the police officers, behind a lot of political candidates, hugely politically influential. His father was a state representative. There's a street named after him. And I've been in many meetings where he was serving that same function, talking to small groups of wealthy people about how to milk their real estate value using the public power of the park board. So it just, when I saw that, it struck me because I'm like, damn, those were like the same events that a big memory I had is we showed up to the park board's annual legislative breakfast. It's supposed to be a public meeting. It's at the Nicollet Island Inn. And when we showed up, they literally tried to tell us, no, you can't come in. And we had to say, like, this is a public meeting. You know, we have a right to be here. And that really, I think was a politicizing moment for me because I realized, like, damn, these people really think they could just get away with whatever they want, you know? So, like, the fact that they've been doing that for over 100 years is like, wow.
Yeah. And you see it come up, like, again and again. And I think that also really resonated with me because I've also been in those meetings where you see all the, like, just like the rich people who are influencing the park board. And I think today it's even more insidious with things like the Park Foundation, where rich people can like directly give money through this private thing that's not public, but then like shapes how the park board makes investments. But anyways, that's like just this whole other fucked up thing. Yeah.
Are there other stories of certain parks that you want to tell or that came up in your research that stood out to you?
I think the one, there are a couple that were like just like really illustrative for me. I think one of the big ones that I think about all the time is the canal between Lake of the Isles and Cedar Lake. So those lakes, like none of the lakes obviously didn't used to be connected, and that canal is man-made. And
wow.
And sort of like the whole shoreline of Lake of the Isles was like super modified to make that real estate more valuable. They did a ton of dredging to make it less of a swamp. They built the second island, like there only used to be one island.
Wow.
And all of that was like done explicitly to increase the real estate values around Lake of the Isles. But then once racial covenants became part of how real estate worked in Minneapolis, like that became part of the story. So Edmund Walden, this guy we talked about already, he bought up a ton of land between Lake of the Isles and Cedar Lake. And you know that he, like, through newspaper clippings, you see these events where he's like working with people in the park board. So he's talking with people at the park board and they're like collaborating and he knows what they're planning. And so he buys this land knowing that they're going to connect the two lakes and they're going to build a new park around Cedar Lake. And he like sees this investment opportunity. And so he buys this chunk of land, including the land where the canal is now, which was just like a swamp. It was like swampy and there were mosquitoes and like no one wanted to live there. This was not a nice part of the city at this point. And then the same day he like officially buys that land and like files it with the county. He also then sells that land where the canal goes to the park board for like super cheap, like $1,000, which just like wasn't a lot of money even at that point. And then the park board like builds a new canal, and then you see in his advertisements like he's talking about like, oh, new lakefront property, like new lagoon that you can like put your boat on. And Edmund Walton went so far as to like plan a giant citywide parade where like he and the park board and like the mayor and a bunch of like huge name city officials had this big celebration when they opened the canals to try and like hype up enthusiasm for buying real estate in these areas. And you see he's like on the same committees with the people in the park board, so you know that they're like working together and planning this together. Wow.
You know, and just like for people who might not be familiar with the geography of Minneapolis, what Rebecca's describing now, that is like a bastion of wealth. Like even for me growing up in Northeast Minneapolis in like a working class neighborhood, it's not like, you know, it wasn't extreme poverty by any means, you know, but even me going from where I lived over there, I was bewildered. You know, it's like, do I belong here? It's mansions. It's literally like, you know, we go there kind of to gawk, and it's like a really different world when you get on that side of Hennepin Avenue and you go back there in the chain of lakes. I know people who've lived many years in Minneapolis and have never gone over there. You know what I'm saying? Or like I've been with people when they see that area for the first time and they're like, damn, people live like this, you know? So again, the history that you're describing is that's not natural. That wasn't the result of like a fair marketplace. It wasn't the result of nature. It was the explicit planning by wealthy men and the power of the state with the park board to create exclusive white neighborhoods and to manipulate things to create that. The other thing that I thought about was just the whole process that you're describing of like the close, like you even say that your research, we know that even the great firsthand documentation that you have, a lot of these deals were made over a cigar or over whiskey in the back room or over lunch. And you talk about Walton being on committees with the mayor and people on the park board. It reminds me so much of the world surrounding development today, the Upper Harbor Terminal. These people are on committees together. Jacob Fry is on the board of the Minneapolis Park Foundation. So is Dana Frank, the owner of First Avenue, who's one of the recipients of the land in the exclusive rights agreement. So this is how capitalism works. That is the ruling class. And our activism is attempting to disrupt and penetrate those spaces, to the point where like at first they tell us you can't even come in. And now they try to send us off. But we have to keep our eyes on the prize and just be clear that they don't, that we should not allow them to make those decisions for us. And we have to break up those like exclusive clubs, Also, the Polads have a house on Lake of the Isles, yeah, it's like one of the newer ones. Like, because the other thing is, I'm not gonna talk about it. My mom don't like when I talk about her experiences on the podcast. But I'll just say my mother is a domestic worker, and her work would bring her over into that neighborhood. So to hear her reflections, you know what I'm saying, is a really brought me to a lot of class consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes so much sense that they have a house on Lake of the Isles, and it probably was covenanted.
Certainly. Yeah, that's the other thing. We're gonna include links, to the research to the best that we can. I'm not sure if it's published yet or if it's ready to share yet. But you really demonstrate too that a lot of the restricted racial covenants in Minneapolis are around parks, and exactly not by accident. And a lot of the parks are around restricted racial covenants.
Yeah. So, and there's a map where people can go through and explore and look like when did the park open? When did the covenants like come to be? And so, yeah, if we link to that, I just think having the visual is like really helpful for seeing like, oh, like this is exactly how it worked.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. We talk a lot about like structural racism or institutionalized racism. And obviously it's like baked into the whole founding of like America. But I feel like some of the power of the mapping prejudice map and like being able to map these racial covenants and then look at like the development of these other systems is you see the process, how structural racism became baked into the fabric of Minneapolis and like how the park board became like so fully intertwined and supporting and producing white supremacy in this city.
Absolutely. Can you talk about like, what do you doing this research? You, even in your paper, talk about the Upper Harbor. What are the implications for this? Like with this research that you've done and the reflecting you've done, what insight does that give you onto the Upper Harbor development?
Yeah. So I think that like there are some really obvious ones, and we've talked a lot already about how the park board has really always worked to advance like real estate interests. And then I think sometimes we talk about like green gentrification in the park, but it's like, oh, this is so surprising. Like we had no idea that it was going to increase property values. Our bad. And it's just like, right. No, like you knew this is literally always how it's worked.
Right.
Surprise. So I think that like that's a big one for me. I also think that like one thing that was really striking to me and like what feels really important is the park board like really rationalized all of these like decisions to collaborate with these segregationist developers. And they're like, well, it's for the benefit of everybody. Like it's for, like everybody benefits by having a new park when like obviously everybody did not benefit. Like specifically the white real estate developers benefited, the white homeowners benefited, but people of color in Minneapolis did not benefit. They did not have access to those park spaces. They were specifically excluded. They were not able to benefit from the increase in property values. And so like to say that everybody benefits is just not true. And then you hear this language about the Upper Harbor Terminal, and they're like everybody is going to benefit. Like this
right.
new park is going to be good for the whole city. But but it's not like if gentrification happens and people on the north side get displaced, like they're not benefiting. So I think that like really stood out for me.
Huge. I think that's so important because like we have to get more specific and in, you know, the way we talk about quote unquote community, like that word community gets thrown around. Like this is going to be great for the north side community, and the property owners and the real estate owners, they know who they mean. And they know that they can deploy that word as if like, oh yeah, it makes you feel warm and fuzzy, but there's no community. There's renters, there's the unsheltered, there's working class people who have mortgages who are barely making it month by month. There's landlords that own a lot of property. There's inherited wealth, and these developments are going to impact people much differently. So I really appreciate you pointing that out, because that kind of universal, this is good for everybody language, it's used against us and we fall for it. And we need to develop like race and class consciousness to call out like, no, this is, and as a matter of fact, it's not only going to not benefit everybody, it comes at the expense of hurting Black people, of hurting poor people, of working people. I just wanted to like, I guess, point out, you said it already, I think, but you talk about one of the ways that parks and real estate developers would work together is like the example at Brackett Park, where the private landholder donated park space, and it was sold as like, oh wow, you know, like generous, they're donating park space. But like you said, it was in their self-interest because they knew that that was going to raise their property values. And it was interest in the park board because they acquired land and created a whites only park. So just to like point to that dynamic of the Upper Harbor, is one thing people point to as a community benefit is they say, you know, there's 48 acres total there. 20 of those acres, the developers being so generous and the cities being so progressive that they're holding that out as a park. And it'll only be 28 that's private development. But again, like you just pointed out, what we have to understand is that's at the behest and in the benefit of the property developer. That's going to make the buildings owned by United Properties more valuable on site. And like you point to in your paper, the people who can afford to pay the rents in those luxury buildings, or the people who can afford to pay the ticket fees to go to this concert, are going to be the people experiencing that park. So it's, again, this like marketed as something universal, but very much in the interest of a small propertied minority.
Mm-hmm. And I think one, so you mentioned earlier, like the hypothetical in the paper, but in the paper, I just raised the question of like, what if the park board had just said no, had said like, we're not going to work with segregationist real estate developers because one of our values is parks should be for everybody. And they hadn't done that. Like, what would have happened to covenants? Like maybe covenants would have stopped being used in Minneapolis. And I just think like, I think about that today. Like, what if the park board just said no? Like, we're not going to accept this land and build a park until we feel like there are like really strong community protections and there's like real affordable housing and there's public housing and there's rent control. Like, what if they took that political stand? Like, I don't think that they would be able to develop the Upper Harbor Terminal without the park board, but they,
Amen.
Yeah, and they just like don't take that stand, and they could.
I think that's such a great point, that they absolutely could. And that would be, you know, is the park board there to benefit everybody, the working classes, to work towards redistribution and racial justice, or is it there to serve the capitalist class? And clearly it was created to serve the capitalist class, and that's what it's done thus far. But they could say no. They act like their hands are tied, you know, but it's like your hands aren't tied. You're a willing collaborationist and you're just pretending like you're not, you know? Same thing this summer. It's like, okay, y'all were sniffing the gas and you, for a week, decided you were an abolitionist and you were going to let people be in the park. And then 2 weeks later, completely reversed course and bowed to the whim of these property owners who wanted to clear the space, you know? So it's like, the park board is still a field of struggle, you know what I'm saying? And I think that's a lot to that your paper points to, and I hope people take it and keep up the fight.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said that well, and I don't know. I think about that all the time. That like, yeah, when we think about, especially when we think about like the sanctuary movement and like who is in those parks and sort of like that process of reclaiming that space and saying like, I have a right to be here. Like as an unsheltered person, as a person of color, I have a right to be here in this park, like isn't just supposed to serve like white property owners. But at the same time, like there's also this reflection of like a deeply racist real estate market that part of that story is these covenants, and also the way that parks were used to create value for white property owners. And so like,
Yes.
if the park board is like serious about like doing equity, quote unquote, then like they have to look at this history and atone for it and like make reparations for it.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of land there. Like I keep thinking about, and it comes up in the Upper Harbor Terminal, you know, is like, what does returning land to the indigenous people look like, and returning land to Black people who have been excluded from wealth, you know, and generally redistributing land and wealth to the poor. And this study makes a great argument for that, you know, and it's true that like white wealth was built at the expense of clearing people off the land and barring them from being there. So to think, yeah, I thought the picture you painted to open up your story is like you have unsheltered people gathered on this park fighting to remain there, with the park board trying to clear them when that land was literally donated to the park by a segregationist real estate developer and was a white only park. Like, it doesn't get more on the nose than that.
Yeah, it's honestly it's just fucking crazy.
It is. Are there any other like you know, big takeaways you had from this study, or things that you like piqued your interest or your curiosity?
I mean, I think that there's like this other part that's sort of part of green gentrification today, about like that, like understanding this story and the way that green space and park spaces, not only in Minneapolis but in cities like all over the country, became like racially coded as white space. I think is just like important to point to and reflect on. Like there are countless stories of people of color being like harassed or violently threatened in spaces of environmental recreation. Like we can even point to this summer, like Christian Cooper in Central Park, or even like Ahmaud Arbery just like going for a run and like trying to enjoy being outside. Like environmental recreation can be physically violent for people of color in America. And part of that has its history in the way that green space was part of the production of white space and exclusive white space. And then today, like thinking about the political role of putting in a new park in a neighborhood that's historically been a community of color. And then there are like a bunch of white people playing soccer in the park. Like that changes the feel of that neighborhood, and that's part of the gentrification process. And so I just wanted to like point to that and call it out.
Yeah. One of the things that I read in your paper, given the kind of setting the context, you talk about the ways that not only are these serene green spaces crafted in these white only neighborhoods, and you know, and you create these little bastions of ecology and environmental privilege, they're dialectically connected to its opposite, which is the site of like toxic extraction and pollution, which were explicitly cordoned off in areas where Black and brown and poor people lived. And I think that story is so much connected to the Upper Harbor, right? Because the GAF shingles factory right next to it, the Northern Meadows recycling plant, you know, whereas in the white wealthy parts, they were getting more tree. Oh, can you talk about that? I'm going to finish my thought, I realize, but just naming that like at the same time that these parks were being developed in white neighborhoods and in a restricted fashion, there was also these sites of toxicity and pollution in Black and brown and poor neighborhoods, and they have a relationship to each other. You have some maps in your research that show kind of the legacy in terms of like tree canopy and temperature. What are some of the ways that this legacy shows up beyond just like the obvious segregation in our city?
Yeah. So if you look at the maps of sort of like different environmental variables in Minneapolis, and you compare it to sort of one, like where were racial covenants, and two, like where do people live in Minneapolis today? Like what neighborhoods are the majority non-white neighborhoods, and what neighborhoods are like exclusively white? Like we have neighborhoods in Minneapolis that are like upwards of 90% white, which is just a crazy level of segregation. And in those neighborhoods, you see that like there's way more tree canopy cover. They're cooler. They have lower temperatures in the summer. They have better air quality. They have more park acreage. Like that's something we've already talked about. So all of these different environmental metrics you can like map directly on to the map of racial covenants and then sort of outcomes today. And it's not just like, I think that when we talk about environmental justice, like obviously it's important to call out the environmental racism of putting a toxic shingle factory in a neighborhood that's majority people of color. Like absolutely we need to call that out. And we need to call out the fact that like in these exclusive white neighborhoods, there's this hoarding of environmental privilege where all of the investment and environmental amenities goes to these neighborhoods. And like we've already said, this isn't like a natural phenomenon. Like this is intentional. This is intentional investment into environmental quality in those neighborhoods. Yeah. And so there's like those maps for people to explore too.
Hell yeah. I think we're at about 50 minutes. I think this has been a really informative interview. Any other last thoughts you want to share with our listeners?
I think that's it for me. Check out the maps and like look at the story for yourself. We only talked about 2 parks, but we call out probably 10 parks at least that we know for sure where this happened. Like in some form, the park board was working with these segregationist developers to build parks, and those are just the ones that like I can document really obviously. I think that it's probably more than that, to be honest. And it like really shaped Minneapolis and sort of the city that we know today and the park system we know today. So yeah, I just encourage people to check out that history for themselves.
Hell yeah. Yeah. Well, I want to say thank you, Rebecca, for the work and for sharing it with me. Like, it's really important work, and I really encourage folks to check it out. The whole park board, it's a 9-person elected body which governs the park board, is up for re-election next year in the municipal elections, along with the city council and along with the mayor. And there was a shift on the park board the last electoral season. There was a really concerted effort to organize new candidates and a racial justice platform. And I don't think without that push, we would have even got the temporary legalization of the encampments. You know what I'm saying? Like, it was the newer members of the park board who were elected on this call for racial justice who even made that effort, you know? And there was one champion in particular on the park board who did a pretty good job and fought the whole time, who was elected in this new wave. And I think there's a lot to learn from that. And I think it's still an area in Minneapolis where we should pay attention and vie for power, you know? Maybe we'll talk more about it on the show, because it's complex for me, because that was my job for some years and it's not any longer, you know? So I'm like trying to figure out where I fit, but I think that the parks are still really important space for us to contest. And I think your research does us a great service and gives us great ammunition to like carry into struggle. So salute to you, Rebecca, and the whole team that you work with. Yeah,
definitely. Thanks. Thanks for having me on. It was really great to talk about this.
Hell yeah. It was great for us too. Anytime you want to come back, you're welcome.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, I gotta also say, you know what I'm saying? Bread, butter, cheese subscribers, you're hearing from one of your own. You know what I'm saying? So thank you for supporting the show.
Oh, wait, I also have one more shout out. You just talked about the team, and I just wanted to say that like really foundational to this work was also like support from Kaylee Swift, who's been on the show, Mira Klein, Hillary Waters, and then also the whole Mapping Prejudice team. And so I just wanted to call out like their intellectual energy that has gone into this project as well.
Hell yeah. Cool. Shout out to them. Shout out to you. Thanks for joining us. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity.